Greetings, distinguished guests, distinguished faculty, and future leaders of tomorrow. I, Akshita, along with my co-host Prateek, send a warm welcome to you all on this special evening dedicated to the post-budget session 2023 on behalf of the Economics Club at IMI New Delhi. The Economics Club, as a knowledge-sharing hub, provides a platform for students to grow and learn through a dynamic array of events and a weekly blog that brings students to grow and learn through business and economic principles of life. And the post-budget session is one of its bright spots, shining a light on the nation's financial landscape and its implications for all of us. Union Finance Minister Shri Nirmala Sitharaman presented the Union Budget 2023 on Wednesday, the fifth budget of Modi Government 2.0. She stated in the last full-fledged budget before the general election next year that the Indian economy is on the right track and will have a bright future. Here are a few key highlights of this year's budget. Sub-Rishi. In this year's budget, the Finance Minister outlined inclusive development, last mile growth, green growth, youth power, unleashing the potential, infrastructure and investment, and financial sector as the 7 priorities of the budget 2023. These sectors have been mentioned as the sub-rishi and will play a key role in complementing each other in India's growth during the Amrit Kaal.
Infrastructure transport. Rupees 10,000 crore have been allotted to Urban Infrastructure Fund to establish for Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. Government to invest 2.40 lakh crore in railways, 50 new airports planned for improved air connectivity. 33% of the government's capital expenditure has been hiked to rupees 10 lakh crore. And green movement. To achieve its goal of net zero carbon emissions, the Indian government has announced a total investment of 35,000 crores with a budget of 20,700 crores. This investment will result in the generation of 13 gigawatts of green energy in Ladakh. In addition, the government has set aside rupees 19,700 crores for the National Hydrogen Mission. 3 artificial intelligence research centers will be established to advance cutting-edge solutions.
Healthcare and support schemes. The government will establish 157 new nursing colleges in strategic locations and introduce new medical device courses to train the youth. PM Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana will implement a scheme to provide free food grains to priority households for 1 year. The government has also increased the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana outlay by 66% to over rupees 79. Taxation. The government has implemented a new tax structure that includes tax exemptions for income up to 3 lakhs and tax rates ranging from 5% to 30% for high income brackets. The budget increased the rebate limit to 7 lakhs and reduced the top income tax rate to 39% by lowering the surcharge for high income individuals. Individuals will benefit from the new structure because it will simplify and ease the tax payment process.
Agriculture and skill development. Government has raised the target for agricultural credit to rupees 20 lakh crore. To assist young rural entrepreneurs and farmers, an agriculture accelerator fund will be established. The government will also train millions of youth through 30 skilling centers and stipend support, as well as establish a national digital library for youth. To impart their invaluable knowledge, provide insightful perspectives, and assist us in comprehending the complexities of the union budget, we are privileged to have in our presence today a multitude of renowned experts from various fields. Dr. ALWYN Singh, Dr. NILANJAN GHOSH, Dr. R. KAVITA Rao, Ms. MADHAVI ARORA, and Mr. R. K. ANAND. Before we begin the session, we would like to briefly introduce our speakers. With great pleasure, we extend our warmest welcome to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Alvin Didar Singh, former Secretary to the Government of India and former Secretary General of FICCI. Dr. Singh is an expert in e-commerce, trade, and migration strategy. He served as Secretary of Overseas Indian Affairs and Secretary General of FICCI. He has been involved with several international organizations, including World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Migration and World Bank's Knowledge Network on Migration. He has a PhD in Policy and Administration of E-commerce, has written several books and received awards for the same. Sir, we are honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
We're delighted to introduce you to our next distinguished panelist, Dr. NILANJAN GHOSH, Director, Center for New Economic Diplomacy and ORF Kolkata Center. Dr. Ghosh is an experienced economist who previously worked as a senior fellow at ORF and as the chief economist at the Multi-Commodity Exchange of India. He's also an accomplished teacher, having taught at various institutions, including Linus University and the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Dr. Ghosh is a renowned expert in ecological economics, 10 books and over 80 peer-reviewed papers. He has also provided consultancy services for organizations such as the World Bank. Sir, we're privileged to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
It gives me great honor to introduce our next panelist, Dr. R. KAVITA Rao, Director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. Dr. Rao's areas of research and interest are tax policy design, design and implementation of goods and services tax, impact of tax incentives, perceptions on tax compliance and implications. Dr. Rao holds a PhD in economics from the Indian Statistical Institute, Calcutta, a master's and bachelor's in economics from Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. Ma'am, we are privileged to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
We're delighted to introduce you to our next distinguished panelist, Ms. MADHAVI Arora, lead economist at MK Global Institutional Equities Desk. Ms. Arora directs macroeconomic research in India and other major countries, focusing on policy, foreign exchange, interest rate, and asset allocation strategies. She has over 13 plus years of rich experience as macroeconomist with reputed banks and brokerage, namely Kotak, JP Morgan, and Edelweiss. In addition to that, she is also being named by Bloomberg as the top Indian growth forecaster and the top ranked women economist in India. Ma'am, we are honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you, my honors.
It gives me great honor to introduce our moderator and speaker for the session, Mr. R.K. Anand, Director, Climate Risk and Finance Council, USA. Mr. Anand holds an MBA in Banking and Finance and a Master's in Economics, a Basin 3 diploma from IBTA in Florida, and several prominent certifications. He is an expert in the BFSI sector and was previously DGM head of the bank's Strategic Management and Economic Advisory Division, Corporate Office PNB. Sir, we are privileged to have you here with us today. Without any further ado, we once again welcome all the guests and request Mr. R.K. Anand to initiate the session.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Agarwal, for giving me this opportunity on behalf of the Economics Club, EMI New Delhi, to which I am gladly associated, I should say, for over a period of 5 years in the past. In my banking, I got introduced to your club, and I am continuing this bond of relationship. I am very happy and glad to have very rich and very experienced panelists with us today, as the introduction has just been given by the club office bearer. So I also, on my personal behalf, say my regards to all the panelist members and welcome to the today's session. Now, as the layout of the current topic today and its delegation has been assigned, like we start with a budget introduction has already been presented by the club. So the scheme goes like that. Each panelist with his experience in the field comes out with his views and his elaboration on the understanding of budget, the current budget, and here the students of the say IMI, which are just waiting to be in the field as the leaders or the budding managers, seek a lot from your rich experience to gain and implement the same while going to the practice very shortly after completion of their course. So with this, the budget discussion is open, and with our understanding of the budget as has been given to us, and we from the learning side are learning that the budget has done a lot in the current environment, which is full of uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity, and complexity globally because of the many global factors, geopolitical factors, the health reasons, climate reasons, and so many things. We are happy to note that the Indian economy growing very well despite all that. The numbers are there in the budget, particularly the effort on the credit dispensation, consumption, and the capex are really seen exemplary in the current budget. And we wish from your experience that how they are going to get executed and unfolded in helping the country in achieving the growth, which is a sustainable growth. And at the same time, there are some factors on the surface which we will be very well, thinking helpful to us in understanding that in this environment against these C's, a sequence of D's, deglobalization, depreciation of the currency, the disinvestment targets, how they are going to fare against, these C's. So this is the alphabets, C and D prominently played, but the 7 priorities here just shown by the club. And the government's focus, 3 broad focuses on the youth, growth and employment, and the strong and stable economic environment to be built up are the keys to be, learned and heard from the experts. So here we declare open to our senior panelists today, requesting Dr. DIDAR Singh to begin with his views on the budget and his takeaways. And then we go one by one. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. I hope that I'm audible. I want to start with a few general statements, which I think the children or the other kids who are going to be just coming out of IMI need to understand in terms of the context in which we are talking today. Thank you very much, and I'm very glad we have such a good panel of really real experts which are going to be talking to us. Now, let me mention what I'm talking about in terms of the general context. First of all, the thing to note is that we give a lot of importance to the budget. Why? Because it's become like a policy statement. It's not just a budget, it's not just a financial statement. It becomes a statement for the government, and therefore it's politically and socially and economically very important for the entire country to place itself in a manner that it does before the world. There are some facts that have been, as mentioned also by the IMI people, the club. This is 2023 we're talking about, 1 year before the next general election. The same thing is in the US too. The US also has 24 as general election for the president. And for both of the countries, 23 becomes a very, very important year because it sets the stage on which we are going to be building. The second important thing we have to understand is that the pandemic is over, but the USSR or the Russian-Ukraine war is not over. Now we have to place this in perspective. This is dampening the entire global economy, and we know that global growth has tremendously slowed down. In fact, the IMF is talking about global growth coming down to almost 2 or 3% from a state which was 5 or 7%. So global growth has slowed down. The pandemic is over, but somehow the global economy still is hurting. Now, the economic survey, which came out one day before the budget, did in fact mention very clearly that our GDP growth also is going to slow down and has talked about 6% plus. This matches what CRISIL is saying and matches also what IMF is saying. IMF incidentally has pegged India's growth at around 6.8%, which is quite high. But basically, if we're going to get into the next league and really become a developed country as we hope to, we need to not just grow at 6%, we need to grow at 9% plus. That's the perspective we must place this in. Now, in terms of the budget itself, I have a few comments to make, which are again general in nature. Number one, it's like walking into, as one of the blogs very clearly showed me today, it's like walking into an agriculture field or walking into a supermarket. You can choose what you want. There is something for everybody. So in many ways, the budget has attempted to address a whole lot of issues in a whole lot of sectors at the same time and give. Your introduction did mention some of the very important 7 key areas. So the 7 key areas actually quote a lot of things which actually go across the board and address every part of the sector or every part of the economy. Now, we do know that as the budget gets put on the place, it is welcomed by FICCI and it is welcomed by ICII, welcomed by all the business associations on the one hand, but it's also criticized very heavily, criticized by the Congress, criticized by the opposition parties, and criticized by CPI and CPM, who say that as usual, it is benefiting only the rich classes and it does not address, actually the budget does not address development as an issue for the lower classes. This is something which comes out every time, every budget has this, but overall, we do know that it's a good balanced budget. It does address a lot of issues, but it's trying to see positives despite the constraints that we are part of. Direction is very clear, and the concept is that we must now look at what progress we are making as a country and as an economy. For this, maybe it's important, Dr. Anand, to actually address what's referred to sometimes as an outcome budget. Do we talk in terms of an outcome budget? We need to actually assess what is happening. What happened last year, what happened the year before that, and what's going to happen this year too. Now, it's very important to make these announcements for the fact of election and 23, but we have to also understand what is the reality in terms of what actually is going on. I'll end by saying that in many ways, it's a good balanced budget, particularly on the taxation front. But in a sense, it's a very small amount of development work which is actually happening, a very small percentage. And key sectors like education and health don't have enough that's coming from it. So despite addressing the 7 different parts of inclusivity, resilience, sustainability, the future, all those aspects, yet we know that in many ways, more can and should have been done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Didar Singh, with your views and your takeaways, your understanding for our help in understanding the budget. Now, after your rich experience into this, we go and mix the things like, say, inviting our panelist, Madam Madhavi ARORA, since we are into the economics club and the hardcore economics is the main subject. So we bring after this rich experience into the administration at a very high level, the eyes of the economist, how do they see this budget setting into the current environment and her understanding on making us understand the scenario. Welcome, Dr. Madhavi Arora, and then we'll go to the public finance and policy sphere with very rich experience from Dr. KAVITA Rao, And we'll go to NILANJAN GHOSH, sir, with his experience on the broader global economic arena on the, say, the budget outlays and the emerging green scenarios. So here we just invite now Madhavi Arora.
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. So, well, I'd like to start with the problem that policymakers across the world have been facing, especially post-COVID. So, emerging market, and specifically India, anyway, has had a very weak fiscal profile, and that sort of sets India apart from most of its emerging markets in terms of a fiscal deficit which is as high as close to 10% of GDP, which includes center, states, and even public sector borrowings. So that all inclusive is close to around 10% of GDP. Of course, that seems to be a very high number in terms of funding pressure that the public sector overall faces. And a reflection of that is somewhere visible in a very high current account deficit. So India has been having a problem of twin deficit, as we normally call it, and that the jugglery between fiscal and current account deficit is what the policymakers tend to manage, which is basically a reflection of your saving or investment gap in general. Pre-pandemic, India was sort of on its way to, bring the fiscal down. It was consistently coming, to manage its fiscal deficit. But the pandemic hit the world. Everywhere around the world, we saw massive spending happening. India was no different, but again, we didn't have much of a fiscal space, which was the case with most emerging markets, because we anyway have a much weaker fiscal profile. And more importantly, we are still to a large extent, capital starved nation, which requires global capital, and thus our fiscal profile tends to, generally seen as a way of sort of attaching a higher risk premium to the economy when foreign investors are coming to our country. So it tends to, sort of pressurize us to not necessarily go out of our way to, expand our fiscal numbers or fiscal balance sheet rather, which was not the case with the West, because most of these countries are anyway base currency countries. They don't need, even if they need funding, the policymakers can just simply print and not depend on the world to fund them, namely the US or even Europe to some extent. Our fiscal profile obviously worsened post-pandemic, and since then we have again back to, bringing our fiscal profile in order. The fiscal deficit had gone to as high as 9.5%. As we sit today, we are sub 6% on a fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. And I think last 2-3 years have been very delicate for the policymakers, especially because, post-COVID, we had seen a very sharp growth recovery. No doubt about it, there was a V-shaped recovery, but it was also very K-shaped and patchy. We've been talking about it. I mean, the students must have read about the fact that how COVID led to more desegregation or in income strata or, oligopolistic structure in general, wherein probably a formal sector actually became captured a much larger share of the value or add in the economy in general. And thus we were seeing a bit of a K-shaped recovery even in the labor market in general, in terms of the wage growth that you were seeing in organized sector. And within organized sector, you were looking probably in sectors like IT and BFSI, which were looking at a much higher growth in wages versus other formal sectors, and informal sectors, which is largely services in especially rural areas, have still been struggling. And in fact, the rural employment still hasn't reached the pre-pandemic participation rate has still not reached the pre-pandemic level. So that is a big worry in general for the policymakers. And the patchy growth has continued this year around as well. In fact, it had slowed from the very high print of growth, because that was essentially led by the rebound in the economy on a very low base. Sitting today, everybody's mostly talking about, say, a 7% or 6.5% kind of a growth. Maybe moving into next year, it could be even lower, close to around 6%. And that is again happening in line with the rest of the world. The reason why it has happened is because post-pandemic, though extraordinary monetary and fiscal policy stimulus that was given to the world has now been withdrawn, both from the fiscal end as well as from the monetary end. We all know that there's been a very high policy rate increases, or very rapid policy rate increases by the US Fed, partly because they were not able to gauge the fact that the kind of stimulus which was given simultaneously fiscal and monetary policy for good 2 years has actually led to more excesses than required and led to overheating, which they're now struggling to take care of. Same has happened back home as well. Policymakers, though since had not given that much stimulus in the monetary or fiscal front, the consolidation has also been relatively more modest. But that said, on a broad basis, both monetary and fiscal policies are not technically on an incremental basis contracting, which basically means the role of public sector in supplying impetus to the economy on a net basis is going to be negative. So that essentially becomes a big problem for an economy which is still struggling to find, strong growth levers. So I think with that delicate backdrop in mind, policymakers had a very difficult task as to how to consolidate. And that is when I think the concept of constraint maximization comes into play, which basically means that given the policy choices that I have, how do I ensure that I maximize my ability to spend on a gross basis, create a higher multiplier effect, which will have a better employment generation or a long potential growth impact, despite the fact that I'm actually consolidating. So fiscal deficit has come down to a 5.9% of GDP from 6.4% in FY23. Despite that, the kind of quality of spend that you have seen in the fiscal deficit, in the fiscal spending, has been tremendously consistent as far as the policy capex push is concerned, to the extent that central government's capital expenditure to GDP ratio has increased to a massive 3.3% of GDP, as against the pre-pandemic ratio of around 1.2, 1.3%. So they've clearly doubled their impetus. On the other hand, revenue expenditure, which is essentially comprises of your interest payments, your subsidies, and other revenue expenditures of different ministries, seems to have also compressed dramatically. And this has happened despite the fact that we have some committed expenditure like wages and pensions and interest payments and to some extent subsidies as well, which the government anyway has to pay irrespective. So there's not much maneuvering that they can do on that front. Despite that, the proportion of revenue expenditure of GDP has actually come down to below 80% of total expenditure, which is I think a tremendous number to look at versus history. While capex as a percentage of total expenditure has actually increased 22% from on an average 10-11% that it used to have, say, 5 years ago. So the policy impetus has been very clear. Yes, we are going to consolidate, but at the same time,
we'll once again come back to you, ma'am. We'll just try to wrap up so that the others join. We'll have a second round again. Okay, fine. You can go with your concluding remarks of the first session.
Oh, am I supposed to speak? I thought I'm done.
No, you are done.
I lost my momentum. I'm so sorry.
Okay, fine. We'll come
So
back.
I'll just finish off. I'm just simply saying that they've ensured that they maximize the fiscal impulse,
Right.
and yet ensure that the fiscal consolidation is in place. So basically, the fiscal thrust has been consistently towards capital expenditure of the center. I'm not getting into details of what states are doing and PSUs are doing, because that combined number will be very different. But at least on center's viewpoint, on a broad basis, what they're looking to do or achieve at this point in time is, a better resource allocation in general, sectoral reforms in general. At the same time, a very stiff or a continuous revenue mobilization, both on taxes front and to some extent asset monetization, which has, I think, been a little weak segment for them, to ensure that the fiscal consolidation continues to take place. Of course, there are difficulties in the process, and there are also loopholes in the fiscal numbers, but I think for the scope of this session, I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your views from the eyes of the lead economist to view the navigation, to give the navigation to all of us for the budget, how it's going to open up. And now we invite Dr. R. KAVITA Rao from her public finance and policy domain. Such rich experience she has, and many of the students, they aspire to learn this subject from that. So how do the current budget fits into your domain, and your takeaways on that will be very much helpful to us in understanding.
Thank you very much. I'll try and briefly raise a couple of issues, comments on the budget because the background of it has already been presented by both Mr. Dr. Didar Singh and Ms. Arora. Um, I'll try and restrict myself to commenting about issues rather than the overall story. So yes, the world has been, we've all been waiting for the consolidation story to continue. Fiscal consolidation becoming a very important benchmark against which governments are being judged. In their ability to again raise resources or create space if there is a future crisis. So in crisis, we expect to spend more, and post-crisis, we expect to roll back fast enough so that we have resources the next time around. So in that sense, I think the government has done a fantastic job. The consolidation is also important from the state side because I think state governments have actually been spending less than what they had proposed in the last financial year. So there is consolidation on both fronts happening. And that for the economy at this moment seems to be a good thing. Turning to the focus of expenditures, the government has given a very big push in capex, which again I think was expected. Capex, I think, needs to be viewed in two, 3 different ways if you're looking at the Indian economy. The first way to look at capex is the private sector investment has not yet picked up in the economy. Private sector is very sluggish. And so to keep growth momentums and to keep excitement about the economy going, we need the government to step up and fill in some of that space. So it gives the government that space to raise resources and to invest and create long-term capacities, which is what infrastructure is all about. It's not about the here and the now. It is a supply side stimulus in that sense. So that's the second way. And I think the third important issue with respect to capex, which I think we should all keep in mind, is we all keep saying that capex is going to create jobs. But infrastructure capex is not really the source of jobs. Capex in infrastructure now is extremely capital intensive. We don't build roads with a lot of labor now. We don't build bridges with a lot of labor now. So we are not looking for blue collar job expansion through capex. We are basically looking at creating more roads and bridges, which makes logistics improve, and therefore, hopefully, in the future, private sector comes in and occupies or provides investment. So I think that is how I would look at capex. Turning to tax revenues, I will be contrarian and say that while I like the fact that we are conservative in how the government has projected potential tax revenues. It sort of gives you some cushion to expand if there is additional revenues, but it doesn't put pressure to compress if we don't have those revenues. So being conservative on taxes is good. However, I am a little uncomfortable with the government choosing to bring in this whole push for the new tax regime. In principle, we want fewer exemptions and incentives, but raising an exemption threshold, effective exemption threshold to about 7 lakhs, reduces the number of people who will potentially pay tax. And if our concern in the medium term is to make sure more Indians are a part of the tax regime, then it is important not to go ahead and provide these little bonanzas. The amount of benefit that you're providing to people is not huge. So why go there? So that's my own discomfort as a tax person, as an economist, coming into how the government has sought to organize its working. The only other thing that I would like to focus on is there is a very telling statement, there's a very telling slogan in the budget which says it's Sabka Saath, Sabka Prayas. So we are expecting everybody to chip in. And so all the initiatives in the budget are for people who are going to step up and start doing stuff. And that is how I'm looking at the budget. So if you seek to do something in agriculture, in pharma, in variety of sectors. That is where you find government announcements coming forth. We are not looking at the citizen per se so much as we are looking at entrepreneurs. So that seems to be the focus. And I'll stop there. If there's stuff, we can come back to it later.
Thank you, ma'am, for your perspective on the field of taxation, which is your strong domain, and your experience on the policy and public finance. We'll be coming back to you once again for another round of learning. Now, with this three-dimensional view on the administration, economics, and the policy, we come to you, Dr. NILANJAN Ghosh, with your rich experience globally and in the Center for New Economic Diplomacy and the ORF. Your experience at MCX also in the field of commodities, to share with us your learning and your take. How do you see this budget unfolding? Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Okay. And let me thank the Economics Club of IMI for inviting me to this very exciting panel. Let's face it that this budget has been presented in the midst of a very dismal global economic backdrop. And when India is the only bright spot when you consider the major economies. So, in fact, Dr. Didar Singh talked about that the fact that why budget remains an important exercise. In fact, though it remains an annual exercise as such, what happens is in its long-term importance lies in the fact that it always keeps on indicating the overall direction that any dispensation intends to drive the economy. This budget exactly does that. And so on one front, in fact, let me reiterate what Professor Rao stated in the context of CapEx. I presume that definitely, I just like to reverberate what she stated in here, because this is not the first time that the capital expenditure or capital investment has been increased, but this has been increased steeply for the third year, and this is almost right now stands at 3.3% of the GDP. Now, in fact, I've been just going through Twitter, and I was finding something very interesting that some people kept on stating, pushing across the simple linear Keynesian perception that this governmental capital expenditure or public investment might result in crowding out of private investment, which is utterly wrong. In fact, Professor Rao clearly mentioned that. Rather, this governmental capex is needed for all those domains where private investors hardly venture out due to high gestation periods and imperceptible returns in the short run. And on the contrary, such capex will only ameliorate business conditions. They will reduce transaction costs of doing business, enable business competitiveness, and in the process promote private investments. And in fact, I distinctly recall this debate came up last year as well, whether we should go for this capex or revenue expenditure. And NIPFP, it's one of the studies by Professor Rao's institution, which clearly states that and also RBI, I presume, also came up with similar studies, similar estimates, almost in same lines. Both the short and the long run multiplier effects of such capital expenditures are many times higher than those of revenue expenditures. So definitely from that perspective, I really welcome this particular move. On the other hand, where I really might have a point of departure from Professor Rao is on the issue of taxation. This is more so because when I'm looking at Indian growth story ever since the last 3 decades, this has largely been a consumption-driven growth story. And this creates an avenue for the government to play with the consumption variable to spur growth, to reduce taxes or interest transfers. In fact, if you look at, suppose, the proportion of consumption in the total GDP, it is tantamount to around 55% of the GDP. So when the growth also slid, in fact, as a result of the pandemic, that was also largely attributed to a decline in consumption expenditure, and the present revival in the growth numbers is also attributable to the rise in the consumption numbers. This has also been noted, in fact, in the economic survey, the recent economic survey. So while this is the positive side of things, there is another aspect that possibly FM and the policy making machinery needs to keep in mind in here when they're playing with this consumption variable, especially with the rationalization of the taxes and giving, and putting across a higher limit tax exemption. So, and that is with respect to the widening wealth inequality in India, which is symptomatic of a counterproductive force leading to future economic slowdown. Now, one needs to remember one thing in here, that the marginal propensity to consume, I'm sure that the economic students in here, the MBA students they have heard of this term. Marginal propensity to consume of the lower and the middle income classes are higher than those of the richer classes. Therefore, unit increase in disposable income in hands of the lower and the middle income groups are likely to find the consumption avenue and spark growth, especially in a consumption-driven growth world. Whereas increase in incomes of the richer classes will get into the saving stream and get converted to assets or wealth, thereby further increasing the wealth inequality. So the idea of a wealth tax, however communistic or leftist it sounds, I am not a communist as such, neither a proponent of any of the communist principles. The idea of a wealth tax and using that either for capital expenditure or transfers or fiscal consolidation would not have been a bad idea in here. So this is my second point when it comes to the taxation regime. Now, at the same time, what this budget has also done, in fact, it is also symptomatic or which is extremely visible. We have been talking about inclusive growth driven by the digital India. And the FM puts this across that this Amrit Kal has to be technology driven, knowledge based. So these are the terms which have often come across, in fact, in the budget speech as well. So I presume the students already presented the 7 principles on the basis of which the entire framework of the budget is based. Now, if you look at all this, consider all these 7 principles, that is inclusive development or green growth, reaching the last mile, infrastructure, or whatever, you will find that it consists of a gamut of issues that touch upon the very fundamental principle of global development governance, and that is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the UN SDGs, are embedded in what, in fact, Sri Lankan economist Mohan Munasinghe here used this term, sustainomics. Sustainomics, in the sense he talked about an irreconcilable trinity, a triangle of equity, efficiency, and sustainability. And that is the biggest challenge, that when you try to address equity and efficiency, are you going to really sacrifice on sustainability? Or if you're trying to address sustainability, are you going to sacrifice on your efficiency? That is, suppose the GDP growth. Now, this happens to be a very, very critical debate. And that is why, in fact, often the growth proponents do not believe in sustainability. Or, in fact, there is a school of thought that has emerged in Europe, which is called the degrowth school. Now, in the process, in fact, this budget has talked about equity issues. It has talked about youth and women. It has talked about the fact that there is a need to harness the human capital. I mean, in January 2023, only India has surpassed China as the world's most populous country, as estimated by the World Population Review. Now, this creates, this has 2 sides. On the one hand, this creates opportunities. On the other hand, it creates challenges. Opportunities in the sense you have a massive pool of human capital. I mean, and more than 65% of this happens to be, in fact, in the age group of between 20 and 50. On a similar note, it needs to be noted that you have to harness and feed in this human capital, provide it with medical facilities, skill them so that they can be used productively. So this is the challenge, in fact, when it comes to the human capital element of the SDG. Other element, when we talk about the entire inclusive wealth approach of nations, it is embedded on 3 capitals. One is definitely the human capital. Second is the physical capital. The physical capital element has already been mentioned by Professor Rao and others in the context of CapEx. So students also mentioned about that. Creating this large-scale infrastructure, which is going to ameliorate the ease of, or rather, let's not use the term ease of doing business, but let's use some business competitiveness. And finally, this is possibly one of the first time that green growth found an emphatic mention in the budget. Now, the flip side also needs to be considered here. The green growth notion is largely based on what we call green transition. But the concern of biodiversity has not really featured. It is largely based on energy transition. Now, when we create large-scale infrastructure, that is going to entail land use change. That is, you might cut down forests, you might convert agro-ecosystems to roads and bridges or linear infrastructure. That shrinks the green space and also shrinks the carbon sink. Now, this again goes against climate action. Now, this budget has not really thought about this aspect. So there is a trade-off in here, which somehow has arisen as far as the budget recommendations are concerned. What is interesting in the FM's acknowledgement is the FM clearly acknowledges the roles of the local communities in conservation efforts while talking about the important ecosystem services of the wetlands. No, here, in fact, there remains an opportunity which is yet to be tapped. Opportunity is to incentivize the local community for their important roles in conservation and so that they play such roles more actively. So there have been global experiments with ecosystem markets through creation of what we call PAYS, or payment for ecosystem services. This budget definitely has gone to that extent, but in future budgetary allocations, a lift can be taken from those learnings. So in the process, actually, if we can conceptualize such an institution, this is going to serve triple objectives if supported by the government. One is definitely help the community's economic conditions through income generation, help conservation goals, help in sustainable development financing.
Yeah,
So
we'll come
definitely
back.
the other important things are there in the context of connectivity, water, and social sector programs. But I think I can talk about
We'll
things
come back,
later
sir.
on.
We'll build upon these fields in detail a little bit. Once again with you.
So can I suggest, can we have a Q&A with children?
Yeah, that is
Really
there.
better because we might
that-
just go out of our
yeah.
scope or their scope. I'm not sure whether how much of that they're actually getting.
Yeah, rightly said, Beth. This is lined up hereafter.
Yeah.
Just some of the common flags which have been brought from the students back to you in the round 2, and then we go to the Q&A directly with the students interface. So here in the second round, we start with Madam Madhavi Arora from her experience in dealing with the global investors and her economic outlook on that. This twin deficit, which you talked, we read in our classes, the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit. Currently, in our analysis, the fiscal deficit has broken up into the center and states differently as a federal government. Now, federalism in India, seen into 2 parts. We take a call that perhaps out of these 2, the CAD seems to be more to be seen critically. And your views on that in the light of the mercantile structure of our imports and exports. And for the time being, we have managed it well, that we have gone change of source of the costless item we import, the oil, gone to the Russia and brought the prices down. That's the reason we have brought moderated inflation also. So going forward in this high rate interest regime globally, and the growth slowing down globally, recessionary or say less inflationary or disinflationary practices being adopted globally. Your guidance to us on the CAD going forward, current account.
So again, just to again bring back the concept of current account deficit, basically it's a reflection of your saving investment gap in the economy. What you cannot fund back home is when you go abroad and sort of borrow from the world in the form of tapping their excess savings, right? So that essentially the gap between domestic savings and investment is what you call current account deficit in general, which is basically tapping the world's saving in general. So India, has had a very bad fiscal profile, especially during the 2012-13 period, which was also the back under the UPA government period, where we saw the twin deficit noise is actually peaking as far as Indian economy is concerned. In fact, I remember that point in time where the students also want to go back and read about the 2013 taper tantrum. I think most of them, who want to pursue finance as a subject should ideally know about the the dynamics of the crisis in the world, of which 2008, of course, is a very important leverage-led crisis, which culminated into certain economies actually having a very heavy leverage when the rate cuts happened across the world. And India, of course, became a very heavily leveraged economy globally, which led to a twin deficit problem resurfacing, and CAD had almost reached 6% of GDP. Since then, India has worked dramatically in terms of reducing its dependence on the world on current account deficit, which also has come in line with the fiscal consolidation. As I said, that current account fiscal deficit tend to go hand in hand. The higher fiscal deficit, the more is the pressure on you as an economy,
Right.
because large part of your domestic savings are being tapped by the government of India
Right.
itself to fund its own fiscal deficit, and thus
Right.
for the private sector, you need to again look for the avenues abroad to fund your gap between saving and investment. So
Right.
India has worked a lot towards on managing its current account deficit.
Right.
What also favored us was the fact that post 12-13 collapse in the global commodity prices, especially in the last 3-4 years, which India being a net importer, almost 85% plus of our oil is imported, and other commodities, energy-driven commodities, which are not just oil, but say, coal to some extent has also, been increasing in terms of our imports on net basis.
Right, man.
Plus, India has also increased its import of, commodities like or segments like electronics,
Right.
which has become the new gold. And of course, gold again is a segment which has seen a very bad
Yeah.
sticky increase. So all of that
Thanks.
essentially has meant that India's current account deficit, even though has come down, it has led to some sticky elements in it.
Right.
We've come down from 6% to now this year we printed a current account deficit of close to 3.3%, with oil actually having seen a relatively higher print than last year.
Right.
And next year we are likely to see a current account deficit further going down to maybe a sub 3%.
Fine.
That looks to be a very comfortable number to
Fine,
take,
fine.
but again, the funding of it is still a problem.
Fine, that helps us,
Yeah.
ma'am, that helps us. In this rapid round, we understand now that it's going to help us in the currency value also to be,
Correct.
saved off and cushioned against that, because from CAD you go to the commodities, from commodities you go to the currency. So we great help in understanding that. In this rapid round, quickly we go once again to Dr. Kavita Rao. In understanding that now this priority or the promotion of new tax regime versus the old tax regime, the orientation of the exemptions available under the old tax regimes to housing, to the education, how they are going to fare into the new tax regime.
Well, the new tax regime builds on the fact that we don't want to give all of these incentives. So anything that was meant as an incentive for savings, for housing, for education, a little bit, insurance, all of these have now been sort of written off. The underlying idea seems to be that citizens are better placed to understand what is in their interest, and therefore they should be given the flexibility to decide whether they want to spend on housing or on health or whatever and so on. So this is a change in how governments view citizens. We are moving away from a paternalistic state where the state believes it knows what's best for the citizen to a situation where we believe the citizen will figure out, and the best way is to make it simple.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insight on this. We actually wanted an expert view on that. And with this, I think something comes as a recommendatory in our talk, like that the old tax regime, the merits thereof be embedded into the new taxation system, and maybe a hybrid system evolves, going forward over a time. Now, from this rapid round, we once again come to Nilanjan Sir, and then we go for the concluding round to Dr. Didar Singh. Sir, Dr. Nilanjan, you have talked about this green element, the environmental, social and governance, ESG, the globe. This talk is there. Then the COP27 recently, and then this G20 meeting, emphasizing this aspect, and every investor looking for, every lender looking for this now, the transition towards the green and the decarbonization, etc. On this path, this budget, as you rightly said, has set some first footsteps by 10,000 bio inputs, some battery energy, emphasis, the coastal shipment areas, the old polluting vehicles to be replaced, and all those things. Now, as this climate change is happening, and to manage this risk, a lot of work is being done. Here also, does it involves, like, say, a huge capital requirement if we talk of the current transitory capital, and then the innovative capital required to replace the machinery? So the capital is such scarce thing, and the higher the risk, the lesser the capital available for all that. So what do you suggest will help us in raising capital for this area?
This is a very, very critical question. In fact, climate financing has been a very thorny issue. And if you look at globally, what is happening is in most cases, it's the debt instruments which have been getting into the climate finance domain. Largely, as far as a nation in the global south, India as a nation in the global south, it is not that we only need funds for mitigation, because all these funds that you are talking of, that is green transition, energy transition especially, these are coming from the mitigation component. We also need funds for adaptation. And when you look at composition, especially of most of these financial institutions, including the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. GCF has a clear bias, GCF and even other institutions, they have a clear bias towards funding the energy transition projects rather than funding adaptation projects. So around 70% or more than 70% of the funding, in fact, in the developing world and in the global south, has gone into mitigation component. And now comes the issue that loss and damage, because in COP27, there has been this new component which has been set up, the loss and damage financing.
Yeah, fine.
So now important issue is that we have to find across a formula or the mathematical model by way of which we monetize this loss and damage. It is not merely the economic cost or the economic value of this loss and damage, but you also have to find the loss of in the context of the long-term opportunities.
Right.
So these are some of the critical issues that arise.
Right.
People are working on them, but by that time, in fact, I presume that we have to find them over the solutions need to be found over the next 2-3 years. We can't wait till 2050 or 2070.
I think this is the very good flag we carry with us for our learning in the classes, and this is a great help to us. Now, in this final round, we come to you, Dr. A. Didar Singh. With your expertise in the e-commerce and the current budget scene, the digitalization emphasis we have seen in the budget, and India done a worldwide great job in JAM, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile Trinity, and the things like DBT, direct benefit transfer. So now with this 7 priorities, the financial inclusion is one top priority which India is placing on this. We like to have your vision that from here, the financial inclusion, how India can go into financial deepening, riding on the bogey of, say, digitalization, and what sort of digitalization and what sort of fund outlay you foresee in implementation thereof, and the not only this budget, but many budgets will be dot points to achieve the final goal.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Dr. Anand. This is the future. And in many ways, while we do accept that climate change will be something which is important and has to be addressed, the whole question of the digital India becomes more and more important. And we're seeing in this budget, there is a special emphasis on digital India, and there is a special emphasis on AI, for example.
Yeah.
AI is something which is talked about sometimes way in the background, but actually is brought up front. Government is addressing it heads on. This is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And India has the strength to do it. We have the engineers to do it. We have the companies to do it. We have private business to do it. So addressing it along with capex and along with taxation regime, which is focusing ostensibly on the entrepreneurs, as Kavita Raoji has correctly said, the attempt is that you will digitize more and more, and you will be in the front of the whole regime, not just for India, but for globally.
Yeah.
And that is the hope. You're absolutely right. It is not one budget that can do it. It will be a consolidation of maybe 5 budgets.
Right.
But the idea is that you go more and more towards it. You go more digital as much as you possibly can. And in that way, transform India. So as somebody has said it very clearly, this is a budget for new India. And this is a budget for digital India. This is a budget that looks to the future. And it's a budget which many other countries will also want to follow, because they will see that this is the future so far as digitization is concerned. Thank you.
Right, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Now I request the office bearers of the club to please take on the session of directly the Q&As of the participants, those who are waiting in the auditorium. Hand over to you, Madam Pooja and Aditya Agarwal and other office bearers, please.
Guys, the floor is open for questions. You can raise your hand.
So, ma'am, Ms. Madhavi Arora, I had a question for you. I wanted to ask that, will this budget help in coping with the recessionary job scenario that has been going on?
The fiscal impulse is on net negative. So, to that extent, of course, the policy impetus is that, and as Dr. Rao also mentioned that to some extent, the infra spending that we are doing it become more capital intensive, but nonetheless, of course, the multiplier effect of it still should lead to higher jobs. Recession, India generally doesn't really seem to have a recession in the technical term. We tend to obviously go through economic cycles with the rest of the world. And once is still not sure, how much is the pain that is impending in the world demand destruction, given the kind of rate hikes that the world has seen. It's anybody's guess whether we're having a soft landing, hard landing, no landing, I don't know. But, on a broad basis, India essentially in the last few years or so, at least post-pandemic, the growth levers were essentially coming from exports, which I think will be fading as you expect the global growth to at least slow down, if not crash. Public investment, of course, is a strong lever, but on net fiscal impulses actually reducing. Private investment is still something which is sort of, evaded for a longest period now. Plus consumption, which was, I think, the bellwether of the economy after 2012-13, when private investment no longer remained a strong lever for growth, has been sort of fading since 2018, and post demon it actually sort of became even more difficult for especially the unorganized sectors or MSME segment to actually sort of continue with the either investment or consumption demand in general. What we saw in the last few years is that the rural sector, which is very high on labor employment, as I mentioned earlier as well, has not really seen an uptick in participation rate. There's actually rural labor participation rate has actually fallen versus the pre-COVID period, and hasn't really recovered, even though we are seeing urban sector relatively doing much better. In all, I think real incomes, of course, have suffered. Rural terms of trade have on an average been negative. It basically means that on net, rural sector is not necessarily gaining much on net incomes. And urban sector, which had seen some disproportionate growth in wages, is also not likely to slow, especially if that is sector slowing its hiring process. And banking and financial sector also now moderating their salary increments. I think urban consumption could also become a big problem. So government has done some tinkering in the taxes, which at the margin helps the lower state of the economy. But again, it's very difficult to say that it will change the whole narrative of the economy in general. And I think we are poised to see a 6 or sub 6% rather GDP growth in the coming year.
I have an open question. Am I audible, ma'am? So seeing the inflation, RBI was seen increasing the repo rate, but now in the budget we are increasing capex. So isn't this contradictory?
Who are you asking this question? Is it for me or for ma'am?
I'm for you.
So monetary and fiscal policies don't have to go hand in hand. Firstly, I mean, there are times when they've not been very complementary in nature. And RBI is doing its job as a central bank, which is independent of fiscal regime in general. Since 2018 onwards, our monetary policy module has basically become single objective oriented, at least on papers, which is basically inflation management. And the policy pushes to ensure that inflation remains in the range of 4 to 6%. 2 to 6%, with 4% being the median number. So that, I think, is the policy base for the Reserve Bank of India. And of course, inflation has been a worry for us. But the kind of capex investment that the policymakers are doing are essentially for productive capacity creation. The supply side reforms on papers tend to, have a more longer term impact on the economy, leads to, actually an increase in productive capacity in the economy, and thus does not lead to an, artificial demand increase, while actually creates job in return of the supply side reform that the policymakers do, or say constructive capacity creation that they do. So to some extent that sort of matches your spending increase, which is not necessarily too inflationary in nature. So it doesn't necessarily contradict with RBI's module of containing inflation.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah.
I have a question open to anyone who would like to answer. So Kavita ma'am rightly mentioned that the government has now decided that they will give the purchasing power to the citizen itself, and they believe that the citizen can decide what is best for them and what they want to spend on. But we know that the tax cut has a lower multiplier effect as compared to an increase in government spending. So is this a right idea to focus on a tax cut right now, especially in a post-pandemic world when there are recessionary tendencies across the globe, across all economies?
Yeah, well, I'll jut my head in and try and answer your question. There are two ways of looking at taxes. One way of looking at taxes is to say that the job of a tax regime is to generate revenues. We are not trying to fine tune and address all the myriad different challenges that an economy faces by tinkering with taxes. That is one way of looking at taxes. And that way of looking at taxes says we should not be worrying about exemptions and concessions and this and that and the other. We should move away from that. If the government seeks to stimulate the economy, seeks to provide support, then it can find many other expenditure side interventions which will provide the support to the economy, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be services, whether it be the final consumer. So that is the basic background for asking for a simplified tax regime. We also, in terms of literature, have not had much success in showing that giving a tax incentive for financial savings, for instance, generates more savings. The general wisdom seems to be that people change the form of savings from one to the other, rather than increase the level of savings. So if the level of savings is independent of taxes, there is no reason why we should be playing that game. So that is how I would look at it. Can governments do more? There is no limit to how much the governments can do. And here I'll put in a little caveat, a little rider on the entire budget discussion, and that is to say that suppose there is a crisis, a la last year. What you budget for various programs can be substantially altered during the course of the year. So we can call it nimble policy making by the government. We can call it responsive budgeting, what have you. But so therefore, if the government perceives that there is a crisis in one or the other segment of the economy, it doesn't have to wait until the next budget to make to undertake course correction. So, as a pure tax kind of a person, it is tempting to say to keep the taxes clean and let some other department worry about stimulating the economy. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll just add to what Kavita ji is saying. Madhavi ji had raised a very, very important concept. She talked about the concept of what she referred to as optimal or maximization of basically the constraints. Constraint maximization is what she talked about. Now, this is really the reality, and this is something that we must all understand. A budget speech and a budget being presented to the country is really a political document more than an economic document. Please understand this very, very clearly. It is not addressing specific aspects of the economy. It tries to set every aspect, but it tries to give something, and maximization of capex is the one particular way of helping everybody along, of helping both the private sector and the government and the consumption people. Everybody is in the bandwagon and must benefit from it. So it's really the constraints which are forcing you to react in a certain manner. Talk about climate change, talk about digitization, talk about agriculture, talk about taxation, all at the same time. And it's a wonderful way of playing it out. So I must say congratulations to whoever has planned this and done this. You've done a very, very good job at it. Thank you.
So my question is to Nilanjan sir. So sir, as part of ease of doing business, like the number of compliances required has been reduced by a lot. So is that a good step? Like, what is your perspective on it? Like, are we by reducing compliances, aren't we doing with the requirements as well?
So right now we have more than 39,000 compliances. They have been reduced. And more than 3,400, I presume, legal provisions which have been decriminalized. Now, do you know how many imprisonment clauses are there in as far as business is concerned, if you want to do business in India? There were 69,233 unique compliances that regulate business in India. And 26,134 clauses have imprisonment clauses as a penalty for non-compliance. So in one sense, almost 2 out of 5 compliances can send an entrepreneur to jail. Now, there are 5 states which have more than 1,000 imprisonment clauses in their business laws: Gujarat, Punjab, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. So on an average, an Indian MSME in the manufacturing sector with more than 150 employees deals with around 700 to 1,000 compliances every year. And then we are talking about ease of doing business. So this is the condition when we are talking about ease of doing business. Rather, we should be talking of jail for doing business. Now, given the fact that this has been reduced a bit, what we have done is you are not going to be jailed for doing business on certain cases. So in the process, this reduces the transaction cost of doing business. transaction cost, when we talk about compliance is one form of transaction cost, which essentially increases the entire business transaction process. Now, even then, I would say that the transaction cost of doing business in India is pretty high. Let me tell you, in fact, I think Madhavi was mentioning about the commodities and the commodities sector. India happens to be among the only 2 nations in the world which has a commodity transaction tax, except for Taiwan. Since I have spent around 8 years in the commodity exchange, and it was during that time that the commodity transaction tax was introduced. Those of you who have gone through a course in finance must have heard of this notion of transaction tax, and this commodity transaction tax on non-agricultural commodities increased the entire hedging cost by around 200 or 300% at that point in time. And that wiped out volumes from the commodity exchanges between 2013-14 and 2015-16. So around 60 to 70% of the volumes were wiped out. So in the process, a very recent paper that we have come out with from ORF, we showed that, well, out of the CTT, commodity transaction tax, the government is getting an annual revenue of 500 crores, but losing out on an annual revenue of 5,500 crores because businesses are being lost out, incomes are being lost out in the process. So the net loss to the government is 5,000 crores annually. So anyway, these are, of course, details that one can get into. But yes, definitely it's a step in the right direction. Even then, we need optimum regulation, but with the right kind of reduction in transaction cost, something that Madhavi mentioned as constrained optimization. So where is essentially the optimum point? That is what we have to find out.
I just have a little rider on what Professor Ghosh just mentioned. I'm tempted to ask, among the 5 states you mentioned which have maximum regulation, Tamil Nadu and Gujarat seem to be 2 of them, which also happen to be the most industrialized and perhaps largest entrepreneurial activity. So the linkage seems to be poor at best. I'm just tempted to know your thoughts on the same.
It's not merely that. Actually, there are many other conditions which create enabling business conditions, but this is definitely, we have so many of them.
Yeah.
So entrepreneurs out there are walking on a very thin rope.
Okay.
I will just add to what Ghosh Saab has so correctly said. It's not the ease of doing business which is that important. It's the cost of doing business. And that is what really determines whether you go to Gujarat or Tamil Nadu or anywhere else. Because the cost there is probably lower than the cost in trying to do it in Madhya Pradesh or Bihar or anywhere else. So they go for that reason. That's the reason private business goes.
Yeah, try out West Bengal, land acquisition. And you will have another Nandigram or Singur or something like that. And so Tatas will leave West Bengal and easily, in fact, at that point in time, they find the land, in fact, in Gujarat. So that's where essentially you compare the costs of doing business.
Right.
Dr. Didar, this question is to you. We know that the contribution of MSME sector is huge and the government is pushing it towards the 50% in the coming years. So what do you think is the specific steps in the budget which addresses this vision?
No, there are specific things about MSME that are there in the budget. I can go into the details of it, but I think you need to separately ask me that question and I'll send it in writing to you. But MSME is definitely right up there. What the issue is, it's not the MSME sector which matters more. What matters is actually the micro sector. And the micro sector has not done well. During pandemic particularly, it's done very, very badly. And that's really the one that needs greater relief. But they don't provide enough jobs. They don't provide enough returns in voting. So they get left out. But government is trying to do more for the MSME sector. It's trying to do more for the SME sector and the micro sector. There's also startups, for example. The present budget has given a lot to the startups. Increase their time that they can apply for their tax exemption and such like is regarded till 24. So they've done well, and startups have certainly done well. And yet we know the startups go and register in Singapore. Isn't that very odd that you find that all these startups which are becoming into so-called, really very successful over the years, they don't want to register in India, they want to register overseas. There must be a reason why they're doing this. Ask yourself that question and you will get an answer.
Fine, I think the experts on the panel have devoted a lot of time and out of their busy schedule in imparting this invaluable knowledge and experience to the students. And now with this round coming to the conclusion, and the message to me that we can conclude this Q&A session. And the experiences you have shared will go a long way in the learning of the senior students, those who are waiting in their wings to be the practitioners in the market and the positions they get. Now, I, with this round over, personally thanking all the seniors on the panel, hand it over finally to the club executives to come out with their vote of thanks to the speakers and then conclude.
Thank you for answering the questions, sir. So it is with gratitude and appreciation that the Economic Club extends its thanks to the esteemed speakers, Dr. DIDAR Singh, Dr. NILANJAN GHOSH, Dr. R. KAVITA Rao, Ms. MADHAVI ARORA, and Mr. R. Anand for gracing us with their presence and imparting their invaluable insights to us all.
With this, we conclude our discussion on the post-budget session. We hope that the session was enlightening for every one of you present here. On behalf of the Economics Club of IMI, we would like to take this opportunity to commend all the panel members, guests, professors, student council, and staff of IMI for making the session an unparalleled success. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the panelists.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.